Hello everyone, welcome to the second Spotlight in June 2026, and this is going to be one heck of a great summer, interesting summer. A mixture of good and bad, but it's going to be very interesting right off the scales no matter how you look at it. Okay, so last night I went out to the movies. Now I work till like 5 in the morning every day, and but last night I had to go out and see a 10:30 showing of Disclosure Day, which is Steven Spielberg's movie that just came out. And I didn't know what to think of it with regard to the reviews. People were saying all sorts of things. It was all over the board, so I just went innocently and saw it for myself. And I couldn't be happier. It was an extremely great movie, but I have to explain to you why. There's a reason. There's specific reasons for it. It's not just I liked it. There's reasons for it and some science reasons for it as well. So let me get into that. But before I do, let me tell you that we are actively putting out as much content as we can at FARSIGHT'Prime.com, and we have 2 new newsspheres in addition to a ET board meeting. So in terms of the Disclosure Day, it's going to be an interesting discussion I have with you, but basically only a few humans knew how to talk telepathically to understand what the extraterrestrials were saying. And we at Farsight have trained for decades on how to do this. So we have our AT board meetings, which come out every month, and you should watch them. So if you are interested in the Disclosure Day movie, you need to see what humans have to go through in order to communicate with extraterrestrials. And so I'll talk more about that later. But we also have a Conversations with Harvey that's almost finished. And right now I want to show you one of our 2 newsspheres. Now we have 2 newsspheres that come out every week. And they are short videos, like 5, 6, 7 minutes, that summarize and give impact for some of our past projects. That's what the Newsphere series is all about. And so the 2 newsspheres for this week are Atlantis, our Atlantis project, and the psychological profile of Adolf Hitler. That's right, Hitler. So we have the Hitler project and we have the Atlantis project. Now those are full-blown projects with remote viewing data all over the place, and you see the remote viewers working blind to describe everything. But these newsspheres are like short summary things, like 5 minutes long, that sort of encapture what it's about so that you can see it and get an idea, and then you want to go see the real thing. You want to go to FARSIGHTPrime.com and watch the full movie where you actually see the remote viewers working blind, and then you say, whoa, dude, that is heavy. So we once did a project on Hitler, and we were interested in Adolf Hitler's psychology. What could cause a person to act like that? Okay. And then we also did a project on the idea of Atlantis. Now the Atlantis project was very interesting because it was based on some sonar readings that were gotten on the floor of the Atlantic off the coast, about 1,000 miles west of Portugal, on the bottom of the ocean. And it sure looks like ruins if you look at it. And then eventually some mainstream people said, nah, those are just called ship tracks, which is when the ships go over, they don't go over perfectly, and they make little marks on the sonar readings and so on. Well, we actually had a person who we knew very well, who had security clearance, and she went in and she actually talked to the people behind the computer desks for those actual sonar readings. And these were the tech people right there in front of the computers. And she asked the techs, and she had her security clearance, she asked the techs, what about these things? People are saying they're ship tracks. What is that? And they laughed. They said, no, are you serious? Those are real elevation changes. And she showed. So that was enough for us to do the Atlantis project. And then afterwards, some mainstream people came in and basically averaged the entire thing, so it just basically smeared it out of the ocean floor. But the original stuff that it was available to be seen on Google Earth on the bottom of the floor was really clear until they smeared it out. Okay, but again, we actually heard from the actual people that had the actual data. These are intelligence people working behind the scenes, behind the computer, who actually had the original data, and they said, no, those are real elevation changes. So that was the basis of our Atlantis project, which I want you to go see on FarsightPrime.com. But today, right now, we have 2 newsfears out every week. And today, the one I'm going to show you is the one on Hitler. Now, this is not the original project. This is the newsfear for that project, which is a summary of what basically happens. And all of these things are done by taking the transcripts, the original transcripts of every word that was spoken by the remote viewers while they were working totally blind to the target, and giving those transcripts to an AI, and then the AI analyzes the stuff under totally objective conditions and summarizes what was actually found. When you have multiple remote viewers saying the exact same thing and they weren't communicating with each other and they were all working blind, the probability of that being random junk is 0. So this is a very interesting project, and it's also very interesting with the Atlantis project. All of our projects are the same thing. So we have probabilities sort of built into those transcripts that were computed by AI. So when you go to farsight.org and go to the vault, and which is in the introduction section of their website, you can take those transcripts and upload them to your AI and get confirmation for all of this stuff. But today I'm going to show you the Hitler one, okay? Now, as you can see with this, we're making advances in the way we produce these videos. It's becoming more and more important for us to rely on animation, so we're trying to get better at the animation. So it's this is Jeannie Safi, who's the actual AI who did the analysis. She's presenting her own results. Anyway, so it's really interesting. So I'm going to show you that right now. This is the Hitler one. And then the other one I'm not showing you because it's up on FarsightPrime.com. They're all up on FarsightPrime.com right now. But in Spotlight, I show you one. And then the other one is always, you go to FarsightPrime.com to see that one. Okay, so let me show you that one. Okay, here we go.
How do you explain pure, unadulterated evil? Historians will point to politics. They'll point to World War I, to economic collapse, to the loud, angry speeches in the Reichstag. But politics doesn't explain the Holocaust. Politics doesn't explain a highly calculated machine built to systematically annihilate millions of souls. To understand the absolute darkest chapter in human history, you have to look past the approved history books. You have to look at the architecture of a fractured mind. At Farsight, we sent our most advanced remote viewers into the psychological structure of Adolf Hitler. We targeted him right at the moment in 1939 when he stood before the world and explicitly announced his intention to wipe out an entire race. What our remote viewers found inside his mind was a shattered mirror. They didn't just see the angry, charismatic leader pacing the stage. They bypassed the political theatre and went straight into his deep subconscious. They found the echoes of horrific, unspeakable childhood trauma. They perceived severe physical and mental abuse that had fundamentally fractured his psyche into multiple schizophrenic identities. He was described as a deeply disturbed, broken man carrying a terrifying inner conflict, a Jekyll and Hyde personality, constantly at war with itself, hiding deep repression and seething, unhealed anger. But a broken man doesn't burn down the world alone. A broken man is simply an open door. When our viewers pushed even deeper into the non-physical realms surrounding Hitler, they realized he was not acting entirely alone. They encountered a chilling, non-human, interdimensional presence. One of our viewers locked eyes with a demonic, ghoul-like entity with glowing eyes, an entity that instantly recognized the remote viewer was watching it. This dark force didn't just influence Hitler. It used his fractured, abused mind as a physical vessel. It hijacked his trauma and weaponized it to orchestrate a planetary catastrophe. The Holocaust was not merely a political cleansing. It was the repetition of an ancient karmic pattern, a systematic mechanism for mass death and energetic harvesting, orchestrated from a level of reality most humans refuse to acknowledge. The remote viewing data even tracked the Hitler personality past his physical death. They found his consciousness dispersed, detached, floating in a surreal, emotionless void, while his physical body was left mouldering in an anonymous, forgotten grave, weighed down by deceit, treachery, and the blood of millions. He was a charismatic puppet, swept along by forces far older and far worse than human politics. If we don't understand the interdimensional mechanics of how the Holocaust was truly orchestrated, if we continue to believe it was just the work of one angry politician, we leave the door wide open for it to happen again. The entities that used Hitler are still out there, looking for new broken minds to use as weapons against humanity. To witness the actual remote viewing sessions, to see the sketches, and to explore the full, unvarnished psychological profile of history's greatest monster, you need to watch the unabridged and terrifying data for yourself. Go to FARSIGHT'Prime.com and watch the Adolf Hitler Project. Don't let history remain a mystery. The truth is waiting.
All right, everybody. So we are back. So that was the new Noosphere. Now that's spelled N-U-U, then S-P-H-E-R-E, because it's sphere in the sense of all-encompassing, but on the other hand, N-U-U is a little different spelling because it's a different concept, a different twist on the idea of new. So anyway, I hope you go to FarsightPrime.com and watch the other Noosphere, and please, the whole idea of the Noospheres is to get you to watch the original project. So even though they were done years ago or months ago or whenever we did them, we have way over 100 major projects. And if you look at all of our videos, it's like 200 or above. And it's so important that you watch the stuff, not just look for the stuff that's out this last couple days, but you watch and digest this stuff. It's like really super important. So anyway, that's the Hitler Noosphere. And the Atlantis Noosphere is really, 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 really great as well. Anyway, so let's go on to Disclosure Day. This is Steven Spielberg's movie. And wow, was I surprised. Given what I was reading on some of the reviews, a lot of people were saying it was like X-Files and more, nothing more than X-Files. That's totally garbage. It was not like X-Files. It went way beyond X-Files. It fully acknowledged the existence of the extraterrestrials, but it did even more. It basically discussed everything that we talked about except for one thing. It talked about how the ET ships are crashing and the occupants are being captured and tortured. And what it didn't say is that there are factions among the ETs, among the extraterrestrials, and what we call the good ETs and the bad ETs. And that was actually appropriate that it didn't go into that complexity, because the purpose of this movie is to really show where we are in the overall mental space that the planet is in right now with regard to the extraterrestrials. And the mental space is not really into the complexities of the good ETs and the bad ETs. The mental space is into the idea of the ETs themselves being real. So the movie sort of painted the bad guys as being the U.S. government, or actually part of the U.S. government. And then there were other parts of the U.S. government, sort of more like rogue parts, who were fighting for disclosure ferociously and risking everything to do it. So it was like there was good guys and bad guys, but they were all part of the U.S. government, present or former. And, and so that was really interesting, but it completely accepted the idea of the ETs being real. I mean, it showed the ETs, it showed them being captured, it showed them dying. It showed that some of the footage was really quite disturbing in that sense as well. So it was very realistic from that perspective. Okay, and that is new. That is new. Okay, but what I want to do now is sort of discuss why the Disclosure Day movie is part of a process that needed to go on, and it's part of the real world momentum of the disclosure process. And so what I want to do is I want to link the premise of Disclosure Day, the movie, and real world momentum of whistleblower testimonies to the actual psychological or the psychology of trauma in the disclosure concept that grounds this entire thing, the entire conversation in hard science. So it's not like, do you think there should be disclosure? You have to understand that there's a process, and the process is grounded in hard science. It's not just an opinion. Yes, I think we should have disclosure. No. It goes beyond that. There's real science behind it. So the movie helps to shift the discussion away from the "are we alone" question to are we psychologically equipped for the answer? And so I want to discuss that. So I'm an academic, of course. I'm a professor at a major university in a social science program, although I do mostly math stuff in that social science program, but still, I'm in a social science field. And so I want to talk a little bit about how academics look at this whole process of disclosing information and what effects it has on people. So when academics look at how hidden, systemic, or even historic trauma is brought to light, well, they heavily focus on pacing, which is sudden versus gradual, is the disclosure sudden versus gradual, and scale, which is are we talking about an individual getting information, or are we talking about a collective, the society, getting information? So I really want to talk about pacing and scale and what academics have talked about, because the disclosure process deals with those two things: how fast the disclosure process should happen, and then the scale, how big it should be. So the first academic I want to talk about is she's got a long name, Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. That's her name, Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. That's a great name. Okay, unusual name, but a great one. So the core concept that Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart has focused on is historical trauma and what she calls the soul wound. The soul wound. Now, the scale focus is collective and intergenerational. So, in Dr. Braveheart's work, it's foundational for understanding how entire communities carry hidden, unaddressed historical trauma across generations. And the whole UFO ET stuff, if you're familiar with any of this stuff that we've been doing at Farsight, yeah, there is generational and historic trauma associated with what the extraterrestrials have been doing. So Dr. Braveheart, she defines historical trauma as a collective complex of psychological and emotional injury that ripples outward across lifespan and generations. So, let's move to organization of the thinking. How does the organization of the thinking, her thinking, work? Well, Dr. Braveheart organizes recovery through a structured collective process rather than a sudden explosion of truth. So, when people have always shouted, yeah, we want disclosure now, now, now. Dr. Braveheart organizes recovery. That's important. We're trying to recover humanity, not destroy it, through structured collective process rather than a sudden explosion of truth. So she argues that when massive systemic truths or past horrors are completely withheld and then suddenly dumped on a population, well, it can trigger widespread cultural freezing or collective shock. Now, folks, if that happens to humanity when the disclosure process happens, what is humanity going to do? It's supposed to be able to make a decision between the good ETs and the bad ETs, but if it's in a state of being frozen with collective shock, how is it going to be able to sort that out? So, to heal the soul wound, as Dr. Braveheart calls it, she advocates for a multi-stage, community-driven framework. It goes like this. First, there's confronting the trauma, which is the acknowledgement that it happened. But the second is understanding the trauma, which is poring over the details in a communal setting. And that is what the movie Disclosure Day does a lot of. It pours over the details in a communal setting. It's the first time I've ever seen any major movie discuss the details like this. And then the third thing is releasing the pain, which is sort of a collective catharsis. And finally, the fourth thing is transcending the trauma, which is shifting from the population feeling the victim to a survivor identity. That's big. That's important. So humanity is not supposed to feel like, oh, I've been tortured, this is a victim. No, you're supposed to shift from the victim to the survivor identity. So Dr. Braveheart's research strongly implies that measured communal processing prevents these collective psyche from shattering under the weight of a massive revelation. And that's important. So let's go to another academic that's look at it from a little different perspective. And that's Dr. Judith Herman. Dr. Judith Herman. Now, her core concept is complex PTSD, and trust me, that's what humanity is dealing with right now. Complex PTSD and the triphasic model of healing. Complex PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and the triphasic model of healing. Now, let's talk about how she looks at scale. So the scale focus is individual with structural community support. So she's focusing on the individual with structured community support. So a seminal figure in trauma studies at Harvard Medical School is who she is. Dr. Judith Herman wrote Trauma and Recovery. That's what she wrote, okay? Now, she revolutionized, and again, she works at Harvard Medical School. She revolutionized the field by studying captives, survivors of prolonged domestic abuse, and also victims of state-sponsored terror. Situations where a dominant authority systematically distorts reality and enforces secrecy. So let's talk about how she organizes her thinking. Dr. Herman is the ultimate champion of gradual, measured dosing of truth and processing. Does everybody get that? She's the top one on the totem pole. She's the ultimate champion of gradual, measured dosing of truth and processing. Not all at once, but gradual and measured. If a person is suddenly confronted with the full, raw reality of a deep withheld trauma without any preparation, they do not pick up the pieces immediately. They typically experience re-traumatization. It gets worse. Severe dissociation or emotional flooding. Well, we don't want that to happen to humanity because we want humanity to take control of things and make a decision to align themselves with the goodies. So they can't be in that state of severe dissociation or emotional flooding. So the nervous system, according to Dr. Herman, the nervous system simply lacks the regulatory capacity to handle it. So she organizes, and when I say to handle it, to handle the sudden dumping of all of the truth all at once. So she organizes the recovery architecture into 3 strict sequential phases. So the first phase is safety and stabilization. And that means establishing physical and psychological stability before exploring the truth, making sure everybody's okay before they open the book and see what happened. And then phase 2, which is remembrance and mourning, which is piecing together the hidden truth bit by bit, translating raw terror into a structured narrative. So you don't want to leave the people in a state of raw terror. You want to lead them to a spot where they're examining it with a structured narrative where they still feel they're in control. And then we have phase 3, which is, she calls it reconnection. Now that's where there's the integrating of newly understood reality into a new future. So this is really, really big. This is really big, and she's great in regard to understanding the value of that gradual process. All right, let's go on to the third one I picked out that's really great. And now this is Dr. James W. Pennebaker. It may be Penne Baker, but I think it's Pennebaker. P-E-N-N-E, then Baker, B-A-K-E-R. I'm not sure about the pronunciation, but Dr. James W. Pennebaker. Now the core concept is, for Dr. Pennebaker, is emotional disclosure and narrative structure. Now, his focus is from the individual to group dynamics. So he's a psychologist at the University of Texas at Austin. Now, Dr. Pennebaker pioneered research in expressive writing and the biological impacts of keeping secrets. And believe me, disclosure is all about keeping secrets. So his work proves that withholding a massive truth or trauma requires active, continuous, physical inhibition that wreaks havoc on the human immune system and the autonomic nervous system. It's bad. So let's talk about how he organizes his thinking. Pennebaker's work provides a brilliant data-driven insight into the question about how people pick up the pieces. And that's what we're going to have to do this summer. We're going to have to start with humanity. Once disclosure happens, we're going to have to start picking up the pieces. And he found that when people are finally allowed to disclose a hidden trauma, the key to whether they function or fall apart is linguistic and narrative organization. That's why the disclosure movie was so important. It helps to translate the entire disclosure process in terms of linguistic, meaning it's something you watch and listen to, and a narrative story organization. So, from Dr. Pennebaker's perspective, the danger of the dump, information dump all at once, is this. If a person just repeatedly vents or is exposed to raw, unorganized, traumatic facts, their psychological markers actually worsen. So here's the power of the narrative that he talks about. If the disclosure allows them to construct a coherent, structured story using causal words like because, therefore, and I now understand, if they can restructure the entire story with words like that, then their physical health improves and their cognitive load drastically drops. So, Dr. Penbaker's work suggests that a gradual structured disclosure gives the human brain the time it needs to build a working mental model of the new reality, whereas a chaotic, rapid dump leaves the brain in a state of high arousal confusion. Humanity's already confused. We don't need any more. Okay? So, anyway, so Dr. Penbaker's stuff was really good. Now, there's one more academic I want to talk about that's got some really interesting stuff, and that's Dr. Jeffrey C. Alexander. So, Dr. Jeffrey C. Alexander has a core concept, which is cultural trauma and collective identity, and that's what we're dealing with disclosure. A whole cultural trauma affecting all of humanity and collective identity. Now, the scale that he works with is collective and societal. So that's very important, because with disclosure, we're talking about moving from the individual to the collective understanding. So Dr. Alexander, he's a sociologist at Yale University. And he moved trauma out of the clinic and into the societal arena. And he developed the theory of cultural trauma, arguing that an event becomes a trauma for an entire society, not because of the event itself, but because of how the society collectively defines, narrates, and chooses to remember it. Do you get the idea? It's not so much the event, it's how society defines, narrates, talks about, and chooses to remember it. So let's talk about how he sort of organizes his thinking. So Dr. Alexander explicitly addresses how communities handle sudden versus gradual information through what he calls the trauma process. Now, when a massive hidden truth is revealed to a society, it initiates a collective crisis of meaning. The community cannot sort it out instantly. That's it. And instead, they enter a highly contested public arena where they must answer 4 fundamental questions. First, what exactly happened? Which is, what is the nature of the pain? Okay? And the second thing is, who was affected? Who did this? What happened? And that's the nature of the victim. The extraterrestrial victims who are tortured after they're captured, but also the human victims who are tortured and killed often to prevent disclosure. And then finally, well, not finally, but then who did this to us? Who are the bad guys? So that's the revelation of the trauma victim to the wider audience. Okay, who did this? Okay, now, finally we have who is responsible. That's the distribution of the target, which is the blame. And Dr. Alexander's framework shows that rapid, full information at a societal level often leads to intense social polarization, institutional blame shifting, and moral panic. Because the societal machinery, which is the press and the legal system and even the arts, it hasn't had time to create a unifying narrative, and that unifying narrative is so important. But a gradual disclosure allows these cultural institutions to slowly reshape the collective identity without tearing the social fabric apart. Isn't it interesting? This is complicated stuff. Disclosure isn't just, yeah, we can handle it. Just, tell us the truth. No, it's not that. It's actually quite complicated whenever you do something like this. So what's the take home from these 4 scholars? If the goal of state-level secrecy was originally to protect the public from a reality they couldn't handle, well, the science suggests that maintaining absolute secrecy and risking a sudden unmanaged leak, which is a disclosure day scenario, is the most psychologically dangerous route a government can take. So controlled, transparent pacing is what allows both the human mind and human civilization to adapt without fracturing. But, there's always a but. But if invested interests, after a long period of time of keeping these secrets, if they become wedded to the idea of continuing the secrecy indefinitely, which is where we are now, claiming that disclosure would disrupt the public, then the rapid disclosure day is the only viable option to prevent the complete rupture of the system. So if someone was doing this just like in a completely organized way, they'd have some type of gradual disclosure process going. But once you get anything going, it becomes a cash cow. And people start saying, okay, well, why should we lose what we're getting from this by having full disclosure? And that's the problem we're dealing with right now. So it's those invested interests that have caused a problem, because the gradual process, as I'll soon describe, has been going on for a long while. But during that time period, there's become invested interests, governmental, military, and commercial interests. And they become wedded to the idea of continuing that secrecy forever because they get money from it, claiming they're going to be looking at those same scholars that I just talked about and saying, you see, disclosure would disrupt the public, and then rapid disclosure is the only. But then if they keep on doing that, then they force a situation in which rapid disclosure, such as a disclosure day, becomes the only viable option. Because if it doesn't happen at all, then you're going to have a complete rupture of the system, a complete rupture of the system. And what we have now in our world is a situation in which disclosure has actually been occurring more or less continuously for decades, but it's not being orchestrated by the powers that be or the bad ETs. It's been happening by the good ETs. Now, let me explain. Give me a chance. So much of this has been the result of direct planting of ideas into society by the group who we at Farsight call the good ETs. Now, there are movies, television, social media, and books that have been largely influenced by the good ETs as a way of introducing, for decades, new ideas into society. Actually, it goes back centuries if you think of some things that took place in religious circles going way back, thousands of years. But these ideas, let's focus on the ones of more recent, within the last 70 years or so. So the good ETs have been involved with dropping ideas into the minds of scriptwriters while they sleep. And that's been a primary way of disclosing certain concepts. That was where Star Wars came out of. That was where Star Trek came out of. The Matrix movies, Ghost in the Shell, all that major stuff. Books, movies, television, all that stuff. A scriptwriter goes to sleep at night, wakes up in the morning, has had some dreams, and says, "Wow, I got a great idea for a new movie or a new episode." And they do it. Now, the good ETs will not force anyone to do that, but they can make the suggestion and then see what the scriptwriter or the producer thinks about that. And if they accept it, then it's their idea and they go off with it. So that's been going on for decades and decades and decades. So basically the entire planet, because of this process and all the movies that have been coming out and television series, the whole planet is now very conversant with the ideas related to space and extraterrestrials. That's not a very difficult concept to talk about. People can talk about extraterrestrials, UFOs, aliens, all over the place. It's just done. Everywhere, every nation on the planet, people know about it. It's not a forbidden topic of information. So much of the trauma part is now over. And trust me, the powers that be didn't want all that, but they couldn't really stop that. Okay? Now, let's talk about the reason this is important. The reason this is important for saving the planet is that humanity is going to have to make a decision soon relating to whether to align themselves with the good ETs or the bad ETs. again, as I mentioned before, Spielberg's movie did not go into the idea of there being different factions among the extraterrestrials. But factions happen everywhere. If you look at the Federalist Papers, which is sort of oddly, those Federalist Papers were basically the propaganda advertisements to sell the idea of forming a new nation, the United States, into a coherent single place. Well, they were very concerned with the idea of factions, and they said basically, this is the founding fathers of the United States said factions can't be avoided. Okay, so they had to come up with structures for a way to deal with factions. So Spielberg's movie didn't go into the idea of there being different factions, but factions happen everywhere. You can't have any society, be it a society on the Earth or in the galaxy, where there's not factions. So that type of discussion about the factions among the ETs, that will come next. But if humanity is not even aware of the ET issue or the debate over UFOs or UAPs, then talking about the different ET factions would traumatize humanity so that it could not make a decision regarding which faction it wanted to align itself with. So the discussion of the factions has to happen afterwards. So right now, in this very preparatory stage of the gradual release of content, especially with the Disclosure movie as being sort of a capstone event for where we are now, this has been very, very, very important. The release of Spielberg's movie, it signals an important shift. Now, please, everyone, you have to get this. This is so important. It is highly unlikely that the powers that be would have allowed Steven Spielberg to produce this movie without official governmental approval. Now listen to me. All major movies done in Hollywood are vetted. They're examined and so on. They're vetted by intelligence people, like CIA. For example, one of the most important intelligence people to vet Hollywood movies on the level of the scripts and things like that, so to vet Hollywood movies and the scripts, was Chase Brandon. Chase Brandon. Now, he worked for the CIA for about 25 years. And he was the primary guy in Hollywood for vetting all those movies for a decade or 2 decades and a half. This is simply done, even today. So Chase Brandon doesn't do it anymore, but somebody else does it. Every single movie is vetted. That is why movies coming out of Hollywood always have a pro-US and pro-military spin to them. Listen, folks, let's be adults here. It would be crazy to think that US intelligence agencies would allow Hollywood to make blockbuster movies that could go against the government's primary objectives. It just would not happen. Not now, not ever. So Spielberg's movie should be considered in this light, and it's really great to be able to look at Spielberg's movie from that perspective, because it's a sign, it's a signal that a decision has been made to move forward with the disclosure agenda. Spielberg's movie, in my opinion, also gives us an idea of how far the U.S. government is planning on going with the disclosure concept. So it's really good to see the movie as a good indicator of where we are, how much the government thinks it's going to be able to talk about. And the movie suggests that the government will acknowledge that the ETs exist. That part of the disclosure will happen. That there has been a secret effort to discredit the idea that extraterrestrials or UFOs have been operating near or on Earth, and that there is a crash retrieval program, something that David Grush and others have been talking about in congressional hearings. Now, this crash retrieval program that the U.S. government has done to capture live what they call non-human biologics. which are ETs. And that some in the government and governmental agencies have fought fearlessly through many years behind the scenes to enable disclosure. Those are the basic elements that are in the movie that is indicating that the U.S. government is going to adopt. So the U.S. government wants to point to bad guys. You always have to have bad guys. But they also want to claim credit for the good guys. They want to come out on the good side of things. So the movie suggests that disclosure will be enabled by the existence of social media. And that's how the movie actually ends. And I'm not going to do a spoiler alert for you on that, but it suggests that this whole process couldn't happen without social media. So this is really important because this tells us that the movie suggests that the government is going to make something more complicated than just the ETs exist. They're going to be talking about who held the stuff back. They're going to have to be talking about the crash retrieval program. They're going to have to talk about the ETs that were captured and tortured. They're going to have to talk about the humans that were sometimes killed in the process of withholding all that information. And they're going to have to talk about that. So there's going to have to be bad guys and good guys. So the government seems to be setting itself up for pointing to the bad guys. Now, it's not clear that you're actually going to know any names of the bad guys. It may just be rogue governmental agencies they'll talk about, but it does look like they're going to be setting the stage for good guys and bad guys. Now, they're not going to be talking about good ETs and bad ETs like the way we do at Farsight, but it looks like they're going to be talking about good guys and bad guys within the government. So let's now talk about timetables for June, July, and August. Now, this is speculation, okay? This is speculation. This is not something that I get just from the movie. So this is just me talking, all right? This is how I think of it. Now, this could be totally wrong. But the Disclosure Day movie follows after a long period of disclosure stuff that has happened with people talking in front of congressional hearings, work by Leslie Kean, the author, David Grush, who gave congressional hearings while he still was working at the Pentagon with a Pentagon security clearance, where the Pentagon actually gave him official permission. His wing of the Pentagon actually gave him official permission to make all that disclosure stuff in front of Congress, and another wing of the Pentagon down the hallway denied everything. So the Pentagon is clearly split. But under oath, David Grush was able to talk about a lot of that stuff, as well as some other, well-placed people, a lot of them actually, under oath in congressional hearings. So you have that first, and then you have an enormous number of people that have been involved in UFO stuff, especially with regard to the abduction phenomenon. And the abduction phenomena is something that big names have talked about, such as John Mack, the late Professor John Mack, who worked at Harvard. He wrote 2 books. The first big one was called Abduction. And we have Dr. David M. Jacobs, who was a professor at Temple University, his latest book, he's retired now, but his latest book is Walking Among Us. And of course, I am the only professor left standing, still working at the universities and academia, talking about this subject. So we have this process sort of taking place for a long time. And so Spielberg's movie doesn't come out of the blue. It comes at a point in time where a lot of people have talked about it for a long period of time. And Spielberg's movie comes sort of as a capstone event for the things that have been talking about. Now, I really personally like the idea that it talked about the capture of the extraterrestrials and the torture, because we deal with extraterrestrials on a regular basis. Yes, at Farsight. And we know that there are good ETs and bad ETs. And our side is what we call the good ETs. So these ETs that are being captured, they're my friends, folks. There are people. We have boardroom meetings where they meet. Here, they've been talking to us, talking to me for my whole life. This is not something new to me. And for those people, a lot of tremendous sacrifice has been made with these people. They're not shooting down the ships that work for the bad ETs. They're shooting down only the ships that work with the good ETs. And they're using technology that is being given to them by the bad ETs in reverse engineering stuff. So back in the day, and decades ago, a deal was made. The U.S. government was aware of the extraterrestrials, and it wanted to know the tech of how these machines work for weapons purposes. The good ETs were asked to help, and the good ETs said, no, we will help with you, but we're not going to help you make weapons. The bad ETs said, weapons, and that's no problem, we'll help. In fact, what we'll do is we'll give you the tech to reverse engineer these ships, and you can go and shoot down the ships yourself. Now, the bad ETs can't shoot down the good ET ships because that would start a shooting war between the two sides. But they can give the tech to the American secret space program, and then the Americans can go and shoot down the ships. And then the good ETs can't defend themselves because psychologically that would traumatize the U.S. government and say, they're the bad guys. They're fighting. We're victims, and that would throw the U.S. government further into the hands of the bad ETs. So the good ETs, when they get shot at, they just have to take it. I mean, they could easily defend themselves on a technical and military level. They could knock out the entire U.S. space program in a second, but they can't do that because that would cause a psychological trauma, and the good ETs are very concerned about the psychological trauma. So you have really good people sacrificing themselves, letting themselves be shot down and captured and tortured. And that was covered in the movie, which was shocking to me to see that Spielberg actually went that far, but he did. So the movie comes out at a time as sort of a capstone event for where we are. So that tells me where the disclosure process is going to become, where it's going to happen. Now, we have also had a big press conference that happened in Washington last week, dealing with, it was organized by Leslie Kean, the author, and a lot of people participated in it, including David Grush. And then we had the disclosure movie. Now, the disclosure movie will take a few weeks to work its way through. Enough people have to see it. So you have to say a disclosure movie comes out that helps people with the disclosure process, producing that narrative that is needed to avoid trauma. But it's going to take a few weeks for that to happen. And then in the first week of July, like July 2nd to 5th, around that time period, the Roswell Museum, UFO Museum in Roswell, New Mexico, is having a big day, a big week actually, festivities for the annual well, it's the what do you call it, it's the time period when the Roswell crash happened in the first week of July. Okay, so that I think it's the 79th annual whatever of that crash. And so they're having a lot of festivities, a lot of people talking. It's going to be a big thing. They're planning something really big, and it looks like it will be a big thing. And so when would the disclosure process happen? So this is my guess. Right now, President Donald Trump is desperately trying to extricate the United States from the Iran war. He needs a win. I don't know how that's going to work out. The Iran war may keep going, but it may be sort of wrapped up, at least U.S. participation in it for a while. And Donald Trump looks like he would like that to happen sooner rather than later. But at that point, he's got to have something good happen. He's got to have a win. because in September, which is only a couple months away, the election season starts for the midterm elections. So it's going to be really important for him to pivot, to change the narrative that's occupying the news these days, away from the Iran war and to something else. And we know that his sons, who know everything about the entire UFO, UAP, extraterrestrial stuff, his sons have been talking to him a lot about it, so he knows about this stuff. And it is, the scuttlebutt has that he would love to be the legendary president that announced the disclosure process. So, when should that happen? Well, if he lets it get close into August, it's getting really close to the pressure of the election campaign, and that's not a good time to have something big like this happen. So, in my opinion, if I was advising President Trump, I would be telling him, have it probably around the third week of July. Have some type of announcement happen in July, but don't let it get into August, and wait a couple weeks or a week and a half after the New Mexico Roswell celebrations for the Roswell UFO crash. Let that sort of die down. You don't want it too close to the Roswell anniversary of the crash, but you want it to be sort of within the time frame of the build-up of the movie, the Roswell annual anniversary for the event, and then a little bit later to have the disclosure concept announced. So I'm expecting something around the third week in July. Now, it may not happen at all. It may be later. It may be in September or October, but in my opinion, if it doesn't happen in July, there's a high probability that they're going to hold it back and not have it at all. So that may be what actually happens. There's a lot of people behind the scenes putting pressure on Donald Trump all sorts of different ways, so we don't really know how it's going to turn out. But that's my prediction. Around the third week of July is the most pregnant time for any type of presidential announcement regarding disclosure to happen. And then they're going to have to organize and rebuild and put things together in August, and then you start the actual campaign time period in September. Now, I don't know what's going to happen with the elections, but that's what I'm looking at for regard to disclosure process. If it follows this timeline, that would make sense to me from a science perspective. That would allow the narrative to be, as you heard me talk about the narrative with regard to the academics, they want the narrative to be structured so it looks like the public is not experiencing a chaotic dumping of events or dumping of information, but a structured revelation of information. And that concept of structure is super important. And if it gets too close to the election, you're going to lose the structure. If it gets too close to, things that are actually happening, like the movie or the Roswell anniversary, then it's like a lot happening too fast. But third week in July seems like a sweet spot. That's how I think of it. We'll see. I could be wrong. But anyway, that's what I'm thinking of, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to me talk about the academics who talk about this stuff. If the disclosure process doesn't happen, then we're going to have total chaos. You're going to get the rupture of the system. So you have this long narrative building up. In order for it to work, there's got to be an end game. And we are at the moment of the end game. That's my thought about this. Okay. Anyway, everybody, I hope you do get a chance to go to FarsightPrime.com and watch the stuff that we have there. It's the largest and only library on the entire planet where all of this content is actually made. You also want to notice how heavily the movie dwells on the concept of telepathy. Steven Spielberg really hit home with that. That telepathy, mental communication between extraterrestrials, is so important. It's dominant. And telepathy happens when mind-to-mind communication happens, and there's a translation that happens. So somebody else will be listening and not be able to understand anything, and another person will hear it in their same language. So Spielberg really hit that home. And if you go to farsightprime.com and listen to our ET board meetings, you hear our people talking telepathically with the extraterrestrials that visit us at the ET board meetings. And those extraterrestrials are, some of them are for example, we have my daughter, who's a hybrid. She comes. We also have a lot of everybody. We have ET social scientists comes, ET AIs come, and we have some ET military people come. We have the whole collection, and they talk about each meeting. And our own people at Farsight, they're at different levels of being able to talk. So, for example, when I talk with the ETs, I just talk with them. And Kamaya and Yeme also talk directly to them. But sometimes Aziz and Intisam and Chante don't talk directly to them, they talk about them. They say things like, well, I'm picking up that, things like that. Whereas Kamaya will look at them straight in the eyes and say, so are you telling me you feel my pain? That was a classic thing she said in one of the past meetings. Anyway, so you get sort of that variety, and by looking at the ET board meetings, you get an idea of how people learn how to communicate telepathically. And if you look at the Spielberg movie, Disclosure Day, you'll see that that's an important issue, and that not everybody knows how to do that. And there's a learning process for learning how to do that. So the ET boardroom meetings are so important because you get to see humans talk with extraterrestrials with telepathy, and how that actually works out. So on that level alone, it's really important to do that. And then of course the conversations with Harvey. I have a couple conversations with Harvey that are coming out soon, that we're going to be using AI, not AI, animation for, to help do these things. I'll explain more about that sort of later, but we're trying to make it sort of visually gripping to you, so you can actually see what we're dealing with. All right, so you're going to be getting, hopefully you're going to get a new mysteries out. You're going to see a new mysteries from us this week. It's in the absolute final stages of being put together. And also a conversations with Harvey should be out this week, and you're going to get 2 new newspheres coming out next weekend. So, and of course I will be back next weekend. Now, the next spotlight is not going to happen on Sunday night. It's going to happen on Monday night, okay? For a reason that I'll explain next week. But next week's spotlight will not be Sunday night, it will be Monday night. All right, everybody. Anyway, this has been a great talk, and I think we had a great turn. Oh, good, look at that. We had a great turnout tonight. So this is really great. I want to thank everybody for being here, and please take a look at what we have at farsightprime.com, including the 2 newspheres, Atlantis and Hitler, and the new Mysteries Project that's coming out in a few days, and then also the new Conversations with Harvey. And I will see you again next week, but not on Sunday, on Monday, okay? Take care, everybody. See you then.